this is a guide to hiring for your startup. And I'll kick it off by asking a question. And that question is, what is the most important part of a startup? Is it A, the idea, B, the technology, or C, the sales and marketing? The answer, of course, is D, none of the above. The most important part of any startup, really of any company, are the people. You could take the idea, you could take the technology, you could take the sales and throw them all away, and you still have a company. In fact, every time a startup pivots, that's exactly what they do. But if you get rid of the people, you have absolutely nothing left. The differences between people are huge, especially in a startup. If you're doing something like manual labor or assembly line work, then the differences between two people aren't going to be that big, 20, 30%. But in creative tasks and things like programming, the differences can be 10 or 20 times, an order of magnitude. So you've really got to hire the right people. It's absolutely essential, and it's especially important in a tiny startup. If you work at a big company and there's 5,000 people and you hire the wrong person, well, you can usually survive it. But if you have a 5-person company and you hire the wrong person, that's a disaster. That's 20% of your company. So what that all amounts to is hiring is really the most important thing you do. There's really the company is just a figment of your imagination. It's just a bunch of people working together. And until you figure out how to hire the right people, until you have a successful hiring strategy, you won't be able to build a successful company. So in this talk, I'm going to talk quite a bit about hiring, but the best piece of hiring advice that I can give you now is this. Don't do it. Or at least, don't do it yet. The reason for this is you really want to stay small for as long as you possibly can. When you're a 5-person company with just a bunch of people sitting around in a living room, then each person just needs to coordinate with 4 other people. If you grow that company to 500 people, now each person has to coordinate with 499 other people. And this overhead of communication, of coordination, it adds up really, really quickly. So you want to stay small. You also want to stay small because you want to build a culture at your company of leverage and efficiency. You want to be like the little ant that can carry many times its body weight. You want to be proud. You want to be able to accomplish a lot with a really small team. But eventually, you will need to grow that team. If you're lucky enough to be successful, if you start gaining some traction, you're going to have to hire people. And once you start doing that, you're going to find that hiring is incredibly time-consuming. If you're a team of 2 co-founders and you need to hire 12 people, that's going to take about 1,000 hours, or about 20 hours every single week for a year. So a lot of founders spend more than a quarter of their time just on hiring and recruiting. Some spend more than half their time. And it's really important that you learn how to spend this time wisely. And that's the focus of this talk. I'm Evgeny Brickman. I also go by the nickname Jim. You can find me on ybrickman.com. You can also find a copy of this slide deck on ybrickman.com under the speaking section. And I wrote a book called Hello Startup, and it's a book about startups. And this book is based on my own experiences being part of the hypergrowth at LinkedIn and TripAdvisor. It's also based on a whole bunch of research, including interviews with many, many developers from most of the successful startups of the last decade. So I was lucky enough to be able to talk to people from Google and Twitter and Facebook and Stripe and many, many other companies. And this talk, I've tried to capture everything I learned about hiring while writing this book. Well, at least everything I can fit into a 1-hour talk. So, outline of the presentation. I'll start by talking about who to hire. Then the second part, I'll move on to where to find these people. And finally, I'll chat a little bit about how to actually interview them and convince them to join your company. So I'll kick it off with a discussion of who to hire. And I'll talk about co-founders, early hires, later hires, and then finally what to look for in pretty much anyone that you hire. So let's look at co-founders. The most important thing I can tell you about co-founders is that you really need one. Paul Graham wrote a great blog post called The 18 Mistakes That Kill Startups, and the number one item on that list, the number one thing that kills startups is having only a single founder. Why? Well, a lot of reasons. You need a co-founder to fill in your weaknesses. Maybe you're like Steve Wozniak and you're a tech genius, but you need that Steve Jobs to fill in the sales and marketing. You need a co-founder to talk you out of bad ideas and just to give you feedback in general and to come up with their own ideas. And maybe most importantly of all, you need a co-founder to share the workload. Startups involve an enormous amount of work and an enormous amount of stress. And when you have a co-founder, each of you has a tendency to think that, oh, I can't let my other co-founder down. You'll prop each other up, and that's a really powerful force. If you're a solo founder, if you're alone, then when you hit an inevitable rough patch, when things are not going well, you're much more likely to give up. The other thing to keep in mind is most investors know how difficult it is for a single founder to succeed, and so they're not as likely to invest in a company with just one founder. In part, this is because if you're a solo founder, that tends to suggest you weren't able to convince anybody to join you. And so maybe there's something wrong with you, or maybe there's something wrong with your idea, and so you really need a co-founder. But you don't want too many co-founders either. Most successful companies have 2 or 3 co-founders. Any more than that, and it gets harder to split the work equally, harder to split the equity, and you start having a lot of infighting and politics, and it's just not as stable. So 2 or 3 founders tends to be the sweet spot. When you're thinking of who to start a company with, keep in mind that building a successful startup takes a really long time. If you look at the numbers, the average time from when you found a company until you have an exit, if you're lucky enough to have an exit, and by exit I mean something like an IPO or an acquisition, the average time is 8 years. And of course, it's really only an exit for the investors. The founders typically stay on for at least a few more years after an IPO or an acquisition. And so this is a 10-year commitment. If you want to build a successful startup, it's going to take you, on average, a decade. This is a photo of Sergey Brin and Larry Page, who are the co-founders of Google, and they founded the company when they were doing their PhDs. And they've been working on it for 20 years, and they might not work anywhere else for the rest of their lives. Now, that's not a bad thing. That's actually awesome. But the reason I bring this up is you should be very, very careful about who you pick as a co-founder, because there's a chance that you're going to be working with them for a very long time. It's a little bit like a marriage, right? You're with them for at least 10 years if you have a successful company. So when you're looking for a co-founder, you generally want to look for someone that you've worked with before. You want a proven relationship. You want to know that you can depend on this person. Some of the other traits to look for, you definitely want somebody with a complementary skill set. So if you're the engineer and guru, go find the sales guy. Ideally, the co-founder is in a similar financial situation as you, because what you don't want is somebody who's looking to make a quick buck paired up with somebody who wants to build the next 100-year company. That's going to lead to a lot of conflicts. And you want somebody you can trust. So typically the best people to find co-founders are going to be your classmates from college and former coworkers. If you've worked with them before, if you've built projects with them before, if you've maybe pulled all-nighters with them before, these are people that you can rely on. Second best are friends and family. Friends and family are good because you can usually trust them, but they're a little bit problematic because not many of us have worked on real projects with friends and family. And also, there's a lot of hard decisions you're going to have to make at a startup, and it's hard to be objective about these decisions when there's a personal or a family relationship on the line. So friends and family are good. College classmates are better. Probably the worst option is to start a company with a complete stranger. So there's these founder dating services these days, and you meet somebody for at most a couple hours, and then you decide to start a company. And in my opinion, that's about as likely to succeed as going to Vegas, having a shotgun wedding with a complete stranger, and then starting a family. It might work, but it probably won't. So try to find people that you've worked with and people that you trust. Once you find a co-founder, you want to split the equity evenly. Just for reference, of the top Y Combinator companies, 0 of them have a significantly unequal equity split, 0. And looks like there's a question. The question is, what do you do if you do not have a person that you've worked with before? Where do you find that person? One of the things I talk about in the book quite a bit is how to grow your network and how to meet new people. And so some of the things you might have to do is start going to conferences, doing hackathons, doing side projects. You can participate in the open source community. But basically, you have to start working on something and working with other people and hopefully build that trust and relationship over time. It's not fast. If you don't have someone today, you won't be able to get one in 5 minutes. It will take time. But a startup takes a decade. So if you're thinking about a startup, hopefully you've planned ahead and given yourself plenty of time to do it. Okay, so you got to split the equity evenly, and you also want to make sure that everyone is on a vesting schedule. If any of the stock stuff is confusing, I invite you to check out the book. I have a really nice primer on how stock and equity and all of that works. And typical vesting schedule is 4 years with a 1-year cliff. Now, the reason you want to do both of these is, as I mentioned before, a startup takes 10 years. It takes a decade. And so it's essential that everybody is bought in for the long term. You don't want to start bickering over who came up with the idea or who built the initial prototype or any of the stuff that happened in the first few months, because to build a successful company, those first few months are just not that important. It's going to take you 10 years, and you really want all of the co-founders to be on board for that time frame. A good way to do that is to split the equity evenly, split the ownership equally, and to make sure everyone's on a vesting schedule so no one can leave after a week and walk away with half the company. So that's co-founders. Second piece, let's talk a little bit about early hires. So you should be as obsessed with who you hire in the early days of a startup, those first 10 to 20 employees, as you are with co-founders. An early hire, bring them in, it's like bringing new DNA into the company. Because when you hire those first 10, 20 employees, what you're really doing is creating a blueprint for the next 100 or maybe even the next 1,000 employees. So be very thoughtful about who you hire, because they're going to determine the company culture. Those first 10 engineers, they're going to determine what technologies you use and all of the processes you use in the company. And it's really going to, and you're also going to hire everyone after that, mostly from their referral networks. So those first 10 or 20 people are extremely important. Take the time to find them, and you as if you're a co-founder, should be very closely involved with that process. Airbnb took about 6 months to hire their first person, half a year to find that right first hire. And the CEO, Brian Chesky, used to ask candidates the following question. He would ask, if you had a year left to live, would you still take this job? Now, that's a pretty extreme question. I don't actually recommend you copy this exactly. I think even Chesky amended the question to 10 years left to live. But the idea behind it is what matters, and that's that those early hires have an incredible influence on the success of a company. If you get them wrong, you're probably not going to succeed. The other thing to keep in mind about early hires is you typically, for most companies, you want to hire generalists. You're looking for that Swiss Army knife or that jack of all trades. And the reason for that is in the early days of a startup, everyone is going to have to do a little bit of everything. Maybe one day you're working on tuning the database, and then the next day you're going to be working on the design for your investor pitch deck, and then the day after that you're going to have to figure out what toilet paper to order for the office. So everyone has to be involved with just about everything, because there's no other option, right? If you have a 10, 20-person company, there's no one else. It's just you. And what you really don't want in those early days is somebody saying, that's not my job. This is a quote from my interview with Julia Grace. She's the CTO of Tindy. And it's true. You really can't succeed if one of those first 10 people start saying, that's not my job. And so what you're looking for is a really broad range of experience. But probably even more importantly is you're looking for the right attitude. You want to hire people in the early days that want to take on new tasks, that are excited about learning new things and handling the unknown. What you don't want is if you're interviewing somebody and they say something like, let's say it's an engineer, and they say something along the lines of, oh, I don't do front-end coding. I would never touch CSS and JavaScript. That's probably not a person you want to hire in the early days. You might want to hold off on them until later. If you're lucky enough, your company will gain some traction. You'll get past those first 10 or 20 employees, and you'll get to later hires. And this is when you can start specializing a little bit. This is when you can start hiring that expert on databases or that VP of sales or that expert designer. And even when you're hiring specialists, something to keep in mind is you really want to hire what are called T-shaped people. Looks like we got one more question. Advice on handling an early hire who wants to be a co-founder. This varies a little bit from situation to situation, but co-founder, really, if you're not involved with founding the company, you're probably not a co-founder. But it's a much deeper question. I'm not sure I'd have time to get into that in the talk, but definitely a good question. So when hiring specialists, even if somebody is the database guru, you still want to hire something called a T-shaped person. This comes from the Valve Handbook for New Employees. And a T-shaped person is somebody who's an expert at one discipline. So that's the vertical leg of the T. But they're also broadly skilled at many other disciplines, and that's the horizontal leg of the T. And just in contrast, and what you don't want to hire is the specialist who's, I guess, shaped like the letter I. In other words, they only have the vertical leg. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, as I've mentioned a few times, things change at startups very, very quickly. So even if you hire that database expert, maybe a year later you're using a completely different database, and they're going to have to learn it. And if they're only good at one thing, they're going to struggle with that. There's also a slightly deeper reason for T-shaped people, and that comes down to the fact that it's very hard to create a really tall T. In other words, it's very hard to become a real expert at something without also having a very broad range of skills. A close analogy to this is in sports. If you think of a professional NFL player, professional football player, they certainly train at football a lot. They go out there and they catch passes and they run drills. But they also spend a lot of time at the gym doing strength and conditioning training, building a broad range of physical fitness, because you need that in any sport. And I really think it's the same with any discipline. I think you need a broad range of mental fitness to be good at any particular specialty. So look for T-shaped people. What are some of the other things to look for? Well, there's a few. One, you really want people who are smart and get things done. This comes from a blog post by Joel Spolsky. And what I mean by smart and get things done, there's a lot of interpretations of this, but the kind of smart that I'm interested in at a startup is not really about book smarts or having a lot of knowledge or having a really high IQ. It's really more about being able to learn and learn quickly. So I'm sort of repeating myself here, but in a startup, everything's changing all the time. You live in a world of uncertainty. And so the kind of people you want to hire are the people that can adapt to that uncertainty. And one way you can test for this in an interview is to pick a topic that you as the interviewer know really, really well and start asking the candidate questions about it and get them to the point where the candidate, they don't know the answer anymore. You want to get them to the point where they don't know the answer. And what you want to see is how do they react? Do they kind of get discouraged and give up immediately? Or do they start asking questions and looking for patterns? And are they comfortable with turning those unknowns into knowns. That's the kind of smart that you're looking for. It's those quick, adaptable learners. But smart by itself isn't really enough. You really need someone who can also get things done. So you've probably all worked with people who are smart, who can talk your ear off and come up with beautiful designs, and they seem brilliant, but they never seem to finish anything. It's always almost ready, or it's almost, they're still building that perfect framework, or they're still trying to perfect every pixel of that design, and they never quite finish. And that's a problem, because at a startup, you're not really going to be successful because you're smart. You're going to be successful because you built something that people want. And so you're really looking for people who have a record, who have a track record of getting things done. One way to look for that is to look at their background and to really drill down into some project they did and see what was their role. What did they actually do? What decisions did they make? If you've ever shipped anything complicated, you know that it's a huge number of trade-offs. You're constantly deciding between good and good enough. And you want to dig into the candidate's background to find if they've ever had to do that. And if you can't find that, then either they've never shipped anything, or potentially they're just not good at communicating it. And that brings us to our next point, which is you really want someone with good communication skills. Most of what you do in any business is really just communication. We have a lot of names for it, but sales is just communicating to a customer why they should buy your product. Programming is largely communicating to other programmers what you want the code to do. Fundraising is just communicating to investors why they should give you money. And so you really need good communication skills. When you're talking to a potential candidate, make sure you can have a good conversation with them. Make sure they can express their thoughts clearly. Also, try to find their writing. Maybe they have a blog, or they've written some articles, or at the least look at their emails. If they're an engineer, try to look at their code and make sure you can understand their writing. And finally, make sure the candidate is good at explaining complicated concepts. Something that Sergey Brin used to do when interviewing people for Google was he would say to the candidate, okay, you got 5 minutes, think of a topic that you know really well, and then teach it to me. And so by the end of the interview, Sergey expected you to teach him something new. And I think that's a great way to interview people, and I think that's a great way to make sure that this person can explain complicated concepts. And this is something they're going to have to do on the job all the time. If you hire them, they're going to be the ones training new hires in the future. They're going to be the ones interviewing people in the future. They might be doing a talk on behalf of your company. And you want to be sure that this person has the communication skills to be a good representative of your company. Probably the last thing, although it may be the most important one to look for in any candidate, is a good culture fit. Part of this comes down to the fact that you're going to spend more than half of your waking hours at work, at any job, more than half of your waking hours. So when you're interviewing somebody, keep that in the back of your head. Ask yourself the question, would I want to work with this person for more than half of my waking hours? At some companies, they call this the no assholes rule. In other words, no matter how good the person is, no matter how smart, if they're an asshole, don't hire them, because that's just way too many hours to spend with somebody that's unpleasant. However, that's only part of culture fit, and unfortunately, it often gets really misinterpreted. So a few years ago, there was this blog post from a startup in San Francisco, and they talked about how they were interviewing a candidate, and they invited him out for beer. And this candidate showed up wearing a suit, and he didn't seem very comfortable with the beer. And in this blog post, this startup proudly discusses how they knew they would never hire somebody who doesn't like beer and who wears a suit. We'd never hire someone that wears a suit. And here's the thing. Not hiring someone because they don't look like you, or because they don't dress like you, or because they don't like the same things that you like, that's not culture fit. That's just discrimination. It's really just discrimination. Real culture fit has nothing to do with likes or taste. Real culture fit is about shared values. I talk about company values and mission quite a bit in the book, but the gist of it is the core values of a company are the enduring principles that you're going to keep and you're going to live by them no matter what your company is doing. You might start working on different products. You might build different, you might even switch to completely different industries. You might even leave the company and go work somewhere else. But you're always going to keep those core values. Those are just the values you live by. And liking beer or not liking suits, those are not values. A real value, for example, is at Zappos, one of their core values is providing amazing customer service. So today Zappos sells shoes online, but if 10 years from now they're in a completely different business, they're still going to build the company around providing amazing customer service. It's one of their most core values. How do they test for culture fit? How do they test that people have that value? Well, what they tell every interview candidate is if you get hired, you're going to spend the first month on the job at Zappos doing customer service. You're just going to be answering customer calls for the first month that you work there. And if you don't believe in customer service as strongly as they do, you're probably just not going to apply for the job. And that is how you test culture fit. That is real culture fit. So identify your company's values, make sure you know what those are, and figure out how to test for those in an interview setting. And don't just reject people because they look a little bit different. Okay, so that's part one. That's who to hire. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about where to actually find these people. And the first place you should always look, and you should keep coming back to this over and over again, is to use your network. When I was doing the interviews for the book with a lot of different startups, what I found is just about every single hire in the early days of a startup, every single one comes through referrals. In other words, it's somebody that the founders knew or worked with before, or somebody their investors knew, or somebody a family friend recommended, but it's always through some kind of a personal referral. And there's a very good reason for this. Referrals fill jobs a lot faster. If you look at the stats, they fill jobs almost twice as fast as if you just post a job on a job board. Referrals also have the highest retention rate. After 2 years, the retention rate for referrals is more than double than somebody that you would just hire off of a job board. And so just overall, referrals are going to be your highest quality hires. And so really, when you're looking for people, what you should be spending most of your time doing is talking to your friends, talking to your colleagues, talk to your family. See if there's anyone that fits at your company, somebody that would be interested. Spend some time on LinkedIn and on Twitter and Facebook and GitHub and search through your networks. There's probably a lot of people that you don't have in mind, but would be a great fit for your company. And grow your network. Go to conferences, go to hackathons, host meetups, build your network, and try to hire people that you actually know. It's also important that everyone at the company is trying to refer people to the company. So you typically want to offer some sort of a referral incentive, maybe a cash bonus, recognition, T-shirts, whatever works. But you want to try to convince everyone at the company to be referring their friends. And pay attention to what percentage of your hires come in through referrals. If it ever drops below about 40 or 50%, that's a pretty bad sign. It might mean that you're just not incentivizing people enough to refer their friends, but it might also mean that they just don't think the company is good enough to refer their friends. So watch that number. It should never really go below 40 or 50%. Second place to look for people is something that I call employer branding. The idea here is you want to attract candidates to your company. You want to create a brand as an amazing place to work. In the marketing world, there's something called inbound marketing, and that's where you bring customers to your product. But instead of putting out an advertisement and buying people's attention, you instead put something valuable out there, something sweet, like a honeypot, to attract people. Now, in marketing, that's to attract people to buy your product, but a lot of the same techniques work to attract people to join your company. And the way you do this is you share valuable content and you teach your audience. That's what employer branding is about. It's really about teaching people. And you do that through things such as blog posts, or by hosting meetups and hackathons, by giving talks at conferences. You do that by open sourcing your code. And what you need to keep in mind is the content that you're sharing, it's not overtly trying to hire people. I'm not talking about a recruiting video. Nobody watches recruiting videos, so don't bother with those. What I'm talking about is content that's valuable for its own sake. So for example, there's an email startup called Send With Us, and they help you send emails. And one of the things that they do is they run a blog that teaches people how to send emails. They teach people how to do email marketing, or they teach people, if you're a startup, how to do user onboarding emails, lots of really valuable resources. They also open source a lot of their email templates and tools. And so they're giving away all of this amazing content for free. They're teaching their audience. And when you do that, what happens is you become the expert. So in the minds of your audience, you become the expert. Send With Us becomes the expert in email sending. And if somebody wants to work in that area, they're much more likely to come to you in the future because you're the expert. So for example, Google and LinkedIn and Facebook release a lot of open source distributed systems tools, all sorts of databases and key value stores and things like that. And every single engineer, who's interested in distributed systems, if you ask them what are the best companies to do that, they're going to tell you Google and LinkedIn and Facebook. And it's because those companies taught them how to do distributed systems in the first place. So spend a lot of time on this stuff. This is a really essential part of any company, is to have the corporate blog and to have the open source software. But even more than just a single corporate account, try to get each individual person at the company to create their own individual brand. So if you have 30 employees, you could potentially have 30 individual brands who are all attracting people to your company. So they have their personal blogs, they have their personal open source projects. That's actually a great way to encourage employees to get better at their jobs too. So this stuff's really important. This is also very, very effective. Just about every company that you think of as a top software startup does some form of blogging and meetups and conferences and open source. Every single one, and that's not a coincidence. Third place to find candidates are job boards. Now, when I say job boards, and when I talk about jobs in general, most people think, oh, I'll just post a job online and people will apply. Well, the problem with that is nobody likes job postings. Nobody. You can't tell them apart. I bet you if I showed you a job posting from Google and Microsoft and Twitter and I just removed the names, you probably wouldn't know which job posting is from which company, which is kind of ridiculous since there's a talent war. You'd think companies would be trying to stand out. Job postings are also full of completely meaningless phrases like results-oriented and must be a team player. And ask yourself honestly, has anyone ever looked at a job post and said, results-oriented? Oh, that's not for me. I can't apply to that job. No one has ever said that in the history of the universe. And these are just meaningless phrases. People skip right over them. Job postings are also full of ridiculous requirements. And that's fine. You can list what you're looking for. But what most job postings don't describe is why the candidate should apply to the job in the first place. Sure, you want somebody with lots of iOS experience, but why should I apply to your job? Job postings don't answer that. But the biggest problem of all is this. The only people that are going to look at a job posting are active job seekers. Now, if you look at the numbers, only about 21% of people are actively seeking a new job. The other 79% are what are called passive candidates. They would be interested if some great new opportunity came along, but they're not actively looking for it. And what that means is if all you do is put a job post on some job board somewhere, at best, you're reaching 1 out of 5 candidates, at best. And if you're hiring programmers, by the way, the numbers are much, much worse. Most of the programmers that I know have applied for one job in their entire life, and that's when they were coming out of college. That's the only time that they ever looked at job postings. After that, all the jobs have come to them through referrals or somebody reaching out, And so if you're hiring programmers, they're not looking at your job posting. I honestly can't remember the last time I looked at one. That doesn't mean job postings are worthless. There are ways to make them effective. So one of the ways to do that is to get creative. This is an example from, I think this was Google, and they put up a billboard with this kind of cool puzzle on it. And they're trying to hire programmers. And of course, programmers are, when we see a puzzle like this, we kind of stop driving and we spend a lot of time trying to figure it out. And this is clever. And this gives you a good reason for why you might be interested in a company, right? They're creative. They solve interesting problems. If you go to my blog on ybrickman.com, there's a blog post called Your Job Posting Sucks. It's easy to remember the name. And there's a bunch more examples of creative job posts. And they're not even job posts. They're really more like job advertisements. You really want to think more like a Don Draper and get creative and think of clever ways to tell people why they should apply to your company. Another thing to make job postings more effective is to make sure you put them in the right places. So you can certainly put them on your typical job boards, things like LinkedIn and Monster. But if you're hiring programmers, you got to put them in the places where programmers spend their time. And that's things like GitHub and Hacker News and Reddit and Stack Overflow. That's where you need to put your content, or engineers aren't going to find it. And there's a list of these places, by the way, on hellostartup.net. Now, even more importantly, the best way to use a job board is not just to post and hope somebody applies, but to find the candidates and reach out to them yourself. And this is actually where a site like LinkedIn is the most useful. There's a product called LinkedIn Recruiter, and it allows you to search through 300+ million members on LinkedIn and contact them directly. And the reason this is so important is, as I mentioned, about 80% of people are passive job candidates. No matter what you do, they're just not going to go and look at your job posting. But if you reach out to them, if you ping them on LinkedIn, on GitHub, on Stack Overflow, and put a job opportunity in front of them, then you might be able to get their interest. Okay, final piece here is something that I refer to as premature optimization. So in the programming world, there's a famous quote, which is that premature optimization is the root of all evil. And what this means is if you take a piece of code and you're trying to make it run really, really fast before you found out if that piece of code is even a bottleneck or if it was slow to begin with, well, then you're basically wasting your time, and you're, in a lot of cases, messing up the code while you're at it. And so there is a form of premature optimization in hiring as well. So there's this old joke where this boss, she's sitting in her office, and she has a stack of resumes on the desk. She randomly takes half the resumes and just throws them in the trash. And everyone's really surprised. What are you doing? And the boss looks around, and she says, I don't hire unlucky people. That's kind of a ridiculous joke, right? Nobody would ever actually throw resumes away at random, right? Except people do all the time. And let me give you a few examples. So one is if you're rejecting people because they have typos in their resume, you're basically throwing resumes away at random. If you're hiring copy editors, sure, then you need somebody who never makes typos. But for all other jobs, the fact that you make a typo probably doesn't predict your performance at that job at all. And so if you're throwing away a resume because there's a spelling mistake, you're basically throwing away a resume at random. Another example, if you're rejecting people because they don't have a specific degree, or they didn't go to the specific university, or even worse, because they don't have GPA or test scores that you're looking for, you're again largely throwing away resumes at random. Google gets, I don't know how many, thousands and thousands of applications every year. They have thousands of employees. And they looked at the numbers, and they found that GPAs and test scores do not predict on-the-job performance. And so if you're rejecting people because of that, you're just throwing resumes away at random. One more example is be thoughtful about the language you use when describing jobs and describing your company. So there was a job ad that came out a couple years ago, and it said something like, do you want to bro down and crush some code? Well, then apply here. And as soon as you use words like bro and ninja and rockstar, you scare away a lot of candidates. Most women certainly are not going to apply to a job that talks about bros, but a lot of men won't either. I would never apply to a job for bros, ever. So if you're using the wrong language, you're throwing away a lot of resumes at random. So the general message here, the way to avoid premature optimization is when you're looking at resumes, when you're looking at people's profiles, don't look for reasons just to throw them away. Don't look for reasons to reject somebody. And one thing to keep in mind, by the way, is people are terrible at creating resumes. They leave off a lot of important things. They overemphasize unimportant things. And so in a lot of cases, if all you do is look for a reason not to interview someone, then more than anything else, you're just testing the person's ability to create a good resume, which has nothing to do with their actual job skills. So a much better strategy is to look for something that shines. This is a quote from my interview with Gail Lackman-McDowell. She's the founder of Career Cup. She's written many books on hiring. She consults on hiring. And what she recommends is look for something that shines. And that means look for something amazing in that person's resume as a reason to interview them rather than looking for reasons not to interview them. So if they do have an awesome college degree and an awesome GPA, that's great. That could be a reason to interview them. But if they don't just toss out the resume. Keep looking. Maybe they have awesome side projects. Maybe they worked at a great company. Look for something that shines. Okay, it looks like we have a question. What are good places to post for non-technical hires? That really depends on the type of non-technical hire you're dealing with. So if you're hiring designers, there's probably specific places that designers go. Maybe Dribbble or Medium has a lot of awesome articles about design. You need to kind of find out how those people think, where they spend their time, and kind of get into their mindset and post on there. Let's see, there's one more question, which is, would you recommend tech consultant agencies? That's a tricky question. I think that really depends on the type of company you're dealing with and what you're working on. Generally speaking, having a full-time hire that's on board and working with you is the best option, but there are many cases when that's difficult or too expensive, and so consultants can be very useful, but I can't give a much deeper question in a short time. A much deeper answer to that in a short time. Okay, so that was where to find people. Third part of this talk is I'll talk about how to actually interview these folks and convince them to join your company. The first thing that I'm going to tell you about is that interviewing is really hard, and everybody is terrible at it. The thing about an interview is you typically get about an hour to make a decision that's going to affect your company and that person's career for years. And you have to make this decision in a very unnatural, high-stress setting. And the simple fact is most people just don't get enough signal during an interview to make a good decision. It's just genuinely very hard. And there's lots of examples of how bad people are at this. So one of my favorites is orchestras. So in the 1970s, only 5% of orchestra members were female. And I guess the excuse people were using back then was this claim that women just weren't as good at playing music as men. But by the 1990s, 35% of orchestra members were female. What changed? Well, one of the major changes was they started using blind auditions. And so the musician would come out onto the stage for their audition, but there would be a curtain hanging up. So you couldn't see who the musician was, but you could hear their music. And as soon as they started doing that, all of a sudden, a lot more women started getting hired. Another great example, maybe a more disturbing one, is from a study of parole judges that found that if you're a prisoner, your chances of getting parole are significantly influenced by the time of day that you have your parole hearing, which should be a little weird, right? What difference does it make what time it is? But what they found was if you had your parole hearing in the morning, your odds of getting parole were around 60%. Right before lunch, your odds dropped to 0%. And then right after lunch, they jump right back to about 60%. And what that means is that the way the judges were feeling, the contents of their stomachs, were far more important than any of the evidence presented at the parole hearing. So there's a couple takeaways from this. First of all, you probably shouldn't interview people right before lunch. But second of all, and more importantly, interviewers will make mistakes. They will be wrong, and they will be wrong frequently. They will sometimes accept somebody they shouldn't have, or they'll reject somebody that they should have accepted. And there's really no great solution to this. I'll talk about a few things that make the interview process better so you get more signal, but there's nothing that's going to be a perfect solution. There's just no way to know if someone's going to be a perfect hire. And so the only real solution is to set the bar very high. In other words, only hire someone if all of the interviewers are really excited about it, if you really found something that shines. And the reason for that is if you make a hiring mistake, it's very costly to fix. If you hire the wrong person, then for a while they're not pulling their own weight. It might be slowing down everyone else at the company as they try to teach them or clean up their mess. Eventually, you might have to fire them, which is a really painful process. And then, of course, once you fire them, now you got to spend a bunch more time hiring somebody new to replace them. So hiring mistakes are really, really costly. But you know interviewers will make mistakes. And so the only thing you can do is to set the bar really, really high to make sure that if you're going to make a mistake, it's usually on the side of rejecting someone. And that unfortunately does mean that occasionally you're going to reject somebody that would have been a perfectly good hire. But that's a lot better than occasionally accepting someone who isn't a good hire. Okay, so with that in mind, I'll walk through really quickly the basic interview process. And the first step is always to connect with the candidate. And you can do that by email, you can do that over the phone, you can do that in person, whatever works for you. But your whole goal in this early stage is just to get the candidate interested and get them excited about your company. And this is something I'm going to repeat several times. Because the most important thing to keep in mind about interview and the interview process is while you are interviewing a candidate, they are interviewing you. It's a two-way process. And you really need to make a strong effort to get that candidate extremely interested in your company. You should do this even before the interview. The employer branding stuff that I was talking about before, all of those blog posts and open source, that's how you get people excited about your company before they're interviewing. But once you start the process, you should take some time to explain to them. Why should they be excited about your company? What's your mission? What kind of things are you building? What is the team like? What are the benefits? So spend some time to get that candidate excited. Second step of the interview process is a phone screen. And most companies do 1 to 3 phone screens. Now, personally, I really don't like talking on the phone, but it's a necessary evil. And the reason for that is on-site interviews are really expensive. You might have to fly the candidate out. You might have to get them a hotel room, rental car, pay for their food. But even more importantly, they take a lot of time, both for the candidate, who's going to lose a couple days, and people at your company are going to lose roughly an entire workday for each person you interview. So they're really expensive. And what you don't want is you don't want to be bringing people on site who are unlikely to pass your on-site interview. And so that's the goal of a phone screen. It's kind of an optimization. It's a cheaper way to filter out candidates that have no chance of passing your on-site interview. And that generally means that your phone screen should be very similar to what you do on-site. In other words, same questions, same level of difficulty, but shorter. So it's just a filter. For the candidates that pass the phone screen, the next step is the on-site interview. And generally, you want the candidate to meet with 4 to 8 interviewers, so a reasonably large number, just to minimize the chances that any one of these interviewers is biased or having a bad day or makes a mistake. So you get a variety of opinions. And you want each of these interviewers to be focused on a different area. So 1 or 2 people can look at communication skills, 1 or 2 people can look at culture fit, a couple of people can check job-specific skills. So that's, if you're hiring a programmer, they would check their coding skills. You also want 1 or 2 people who are closers. And what I mean by closer is this is somebody who, once again, is just there to try to get the candidate interested in the job. So a closer at an on-site interview would take the candidate around the office. They would take them to lunch. They would introduce them to people. They would talk about the company's mission. They would talk about the project that you're working on. Maybe show them a slide deck or a video or walk them through the code. Answer their questions. Get them interested. You're not really even interviewing them. This is really a position to kind of make the candidate feel at ease and relaxed and interested in your company. And interview processes that don't have a closer, almost certainly their accept rate for offers is a lot lower. Now, really important thing about on-site interviews, really any interview, is don't confuse an interview with an interrogation. Okay? Your goal at an interview is learning. It's not to get a confession out of this poor candidate. I've seen so many interviewers walk into a room and just start throwing like really hard questions at a candidate without so much as a hello. And look, they're not going to confess to you that they're a terrible coder. All you're doing is creating a hostile and terrible experience for them. So remember, your goal is learning. You're having a conversation with a human being. Be nice. Say hi. Ask them how their day is. And make sure you're learning. And make sure they have a good experience because, again, while you're interviewing them, they are interviewing you. And so you really need to make sure that your interviewers are good representatives of your company. And what that usually means is you need to have interviewing built into your schedule. And not just interviewing, but also preparing for interviews. Training at interviews, right? You have to know how to check culture fit. You have to know how to check communication skills. You need to have that built into the schedule. You need to reward people who do it well. And what you don't want is people seeing interviewing as a chore, as something that takes them away from their real work. Because remember, hiring is the most important thing you do. It is the real work. And you need to allocate time accordingly. I'll talk a little bit about the questions you should ask in an interview. It's a little hard to do this broadly for all the different types of interviews that you could do, but there's a few things I can say that I think will be useful for just about everyone. And so the first one is this. Puzzlers and brain teasers are terrible interview questions. Google used brain teasers for a while. They would ask people to estimate how many chimney sweepers there are in New York City. And Google did the research on this, and they found that these brain teasers, how you performed on them, did not in any way predict your performance on the job. The only thing that brain teasers did was they made the interviewer feel smart. They're terrible interview questions. Don't use them. If you're hiring programmers, the industry standard is whiteboard coding. And the way most companies do it, it's also an awful interview practice. So the typical coding interview these days is you ask the candidate some question that you found usually from like a CS 101 course. And you ask them to come up with the answer while talking out loud and then to write code by hand on a whiteboard. And of course, on a whiteboard, you can't copy and paste, so refactoring is really hard. There's no compiler. You can't run tests, so you can't develop your solution iteratively. You just kind of have to come up with it all at once. There's no syntax highlighting. You can't Google anything. You can't use any open source libraries. You have no documentation. And normally in programming, we say premature optimization is the root of all evil, except in most technical interviews where we then have the candidate spend a lot of time optimizing the hell out of 3 lines of code. And I'll be honest with you, if anyone wrote code like this in the real world, I'd be tempted to fire them. And yet most companies use this as their interview practice, and that makes no sense to me. The good news is there are much better alternatives. I came across quite a few really interesting ones while doing interviews for my book, and I'll give you a few examples. So one, and probably one that you can apply to just about any interview, programmer or otherwise, is to just have the person work on real-world problems. So for example, at GitHub, when a candidate comes in, they sit down with them and they do some pair coding, and it's usually on real GitHub code. So maybe they'll check out an open source project and they'll have the candidate fix a few bugs. And that's a real world problem. That's what they would actually be doing on the job. And it's a much better interview experience. At Jawbone, when they hire data scientists, the way the interview works is they give the data scientist a laptop and a data set, a really large data set. And they say, take 3 hours, explore this data set, and come up with some interesting findings. And this is what data scientists really do. That's the actual job. And so this is a great way to interview them and see their technical skills, how good are they at parsing this data. You can see their creativity at coming up with interesting findings. And you get to see their presentation skills, their communication skills as well. Another awesome interview practice comes from the book Peopleware. And this is, again, one that you can use for any kind of job. Tell the candidate ahead of time to prepare a talk. It doesn't have to be long, 10 to 15 minutes is fine. And they'll show up and you'll get the team together and they'll do a talk for your team, usually about something they've worked on in the past. And this gives you a good sense of the candidate's communication skills, gives you a good sense of how well they understood something in the past and the trade-offs they made and whether they're smart and knew how to get things done. And it also allows them to interact with a lot of people on the team when they're asking questions in a really short time frame. So I think this is a great part of just about any interview. Something that Pinterest used to do when they didn't have enough engineers to do all the phone screens that they wanted to, is they had a step even before the phone screen. They would ask candidates to do a take-home problem, some sort of coding exercise that takes a few hours, and they would email in their solution, and if the solution was garbage, then the interview, they wouldn't have to phone screen that person. And if it was a good solution, then they would have something really interesting to discuss during the phone screen and make sure the candidate actually wrote the code and understood what they did and could explain their trade-offs and decisions and things like that. At Coursera, they ask candidates to bring their own laptops. And on your own laptop, you have your own coding environment set up, and it's a natural environment. And so when you do a coding problem, it's the way you would do it in the real world. And final one, and this is my personal favorite, and again, this can be used for any type of job that you're hiring for, is what they do at TypeSafe. At TypeSafe, they bring in candidates for 1 to 2 days, and they just have them do a real workday. So if it's a programmer that they're hiring, they'll give the programmer a laptop and they'll assign a mentor, and the mentor will help the candidate check out the code, maybe fix some bugs. They'll go to meetings, they'll go to lunch, they'll hang out with the team. They just go through a normal workday. And when you do this, of course, you get the best signal because you get to see exactly how the candidate would perform if you actually hired them. And the candidate has an awesome interview experience because they get to see exactly what the job is all about. And this is, I think this is an interview practice most companies can do. If you have a really, really steep ramp-up time, then you might not be able to, but most companies could do something like this, and it's a much better interview practice than some sort of arbitrary CS 101 problem or brain teasers or any of that other garbage. Okay, it looks like there's one more question. How much equity should be given to a co-founder who doesn't have time for the startup anymore? So it's a little bit of a tough question. Generally, when you start a company, you file the paperwork, so you do a Delaware C corporation or something like that. And that's when you come up with what's called the cap table, which is how you split the equity. And so you actually make that decision ahead of time, right? So if the co-founder quits at some point, maybe a few weeks later they quit, you've already decided how much equity they have. And one of the things I mentioned earlier is you put them on a vesting schedule. And so usually you don't get, if let's say there's 2 co-founders and they each agree to have 50% of the company, then you don't actually get any of that equity immediately. You get it over a time period of, let's say, 4 years. And so if they leave after 2 weeks, they get pretty much no equity. So that's usually the best way to deal with it, is to agree with it, to agree on it ahead of time, and then there's no more problem. One more question came up. Let's see. It has been said that interviews are not predictive of job performance, that blind auditions are much better. How do you feel about this? I certainly agree that most interview practices are probably not indicative of job performance. I mean, as I said, interviewing is really hard, and most people are doing a little better than just guessing, right? Oh, I kind of like that guy. Maybe I'll hire him. And so some of the things that I just walked through, some of these examples, are kind of alternatives that hopefully give you a little more signal. So I'm not sure exactly what you mean by blind auditions. I mean, I know what those would be, for example, for music. I'm not sure you can do blind auditions for all jobs, but if you can, I think that's great. And I think something like what I just mentioned, going through a real workday as you do on Tshaped, it's really not an interview. It really is more of an audition. I believe that's going to be a much more effective interview practice for most companies. But I don't think there's any practice that'll give you any sort of guarantee. I think at the end of the day, it's still going to be a pretty error-prone process because it's hard. You don't know until you've worked with someone for a while if they're a great fit or not. Okay, final part of the talk is making an offer. So you've found an awesome candidate, they've passed your interview, what do you do next? Well, the first step is to check references. The candidate should be able to provide some. You can dig through your own network to find some more. And there's two main things you're looking for with a reference check. The first is you want to know, what did this person actually accomplish? So again, you're looking for what projects did they work on and what was their actual role, right? You don't want somebody who just went along for the ride. You want to know what decisions, what things did they actually build, what trade-offs did they make. But the second thing is to find out what it was like working with this person. You want to ask, was this person smart? Did they get things done? Did they have good communication skills? Would you want to work with this person again? Was this person one of the top 1% or 5% of people that you've ever worked with, right? You want to get a sense of what this person was like. And again, mostly here, you're just looking for something that shines because interviews are imperfect. And so you're just looking for more data from somebody who's had experience working with this person. By the way, this is why referrals are so important, is someone who's actually worked with a person will be able to give you much better information than you'll ever get from an interview. So that's another reason referral hires tend to be the most effective ones. So if the reference checks go well, you want to make an offer as quickly as you can. And you typically want to do it in person or at least over the phone. Why? Well, this is one more chance for you to express to the candidate and why this job is awesome and to get them excited about your company. And that's much easier to do over the phone or in person than it is with some email or a legal-looking offer letter. So talk to them. Tell them how excited you are to have them join. Tell them how awesome the opportunity is. Get them excited about this offer. After that, follow up in writing. Send them the actual offer so they can look at it, read it over, and have some time to think about it. You may also want to follow up even after that. So, for example, when I was interviewing with TripAdvisor, they made me an offer, and then I had a few weeks to think about it. And about a week later, they sent me a care package. And in their care package, there was a really nice TripAdvisor hoodie, I think some snacks, and a note that said something like, "We're really excited to have you join. If you have any questions, if you want to meet with anybody else, just let us know." And it probably didn't take them very long. It probably didn't cost them very much, but 8 years later, I still remember it, and it had a pretty strong impact. It made me feel, as a candidate, that this company really wanted me there. That's really important, so don't forget to follow up. Now, the offer itself has 4 main pieces. The first part should always be the opportunity. So you're probably sick of me hearing me say this, but once again, even in the offer letter, you need to take the time to tell the candidate why they should be excited about joining your company. You need to tell them why this is an awesome place to work. And let me give you an example. So this is apparently a note that you get right at the beginning of your offer letter if you get an offer from Apple. And here's what it says. There's work and there's your life's work. The kind of work that has your fingerprints all over it. The kind of work that you'd never compromise on, that you'd sacrifice a weekend for. You can do that kind of work at Apple. People don't come here to play it safe. They come here to swim in the deep end. They want their work to add up to something big, something that couldn't happen anywhere else. Welcome to Apple. Now you tell me, would you rather see that at the start of your offer letter or just some boring-looking legal jargon about at-will employment and how the company could fire you at any time? Your choice. Second part of an offer is the salary. Now, the most important thing about the salary is that the candidate feels that it's a fair salary, right? Not every company will be able to make every candidate happy with the salary that they offer, especially startups that don't have a lot of cash to spend. But you want the candidate to feel like they're being treated fairly, that you're not cheating them out of money, that you're not trying to lowball them, that you didn't just make up the number randomly. And the best way to do that for most startups is to be transparent. In other words, to tell the candidate how you came up with the number. So for example, you could determine everybody's salary using a formula. This is actually a formula from a startup called Buffer, and they're actually so transparent that they reveal all of their salary publicly. I think that's cool. You don't have to do that, but you should at least tell the candidate how you came up with the salary. And so here in this formula, you can see that you plug in the job type, the seniority, a few other details, and you just get a number out the other end. Another option is to use a table. And so all executives at this company will make this much, and all senior employees will get this much, and so on and so forth. Again, it's transparent, it's obvious, and it applies to everyone at the company. And if you want to see a few more examples of this, on hellostartup.net, there's a bunch of salary resources and calculators you can use to find reasonable baselines for your area and things like that. Third part of the offer is the equity. Most startups can't match big companies in terms of salary. So to make up for it, you offer the candidate a piece of the company in the form of stock. And once again, the most important thing here is to be fair. Again, the candidate should feel like you're treating them fairly. They might not accept the offer. They might want more, but they're much more likely to accept it if they know how you came up with the numbers because you're transparent. And so once again, you can use a formula. This formula is the equity equation. And the intuition behind this formula is you should be willing to give somebody 5% of your company if the 95% that you have left will end up being worth more than the full 100% because that person joined. And if you go to hellostartup.net, there's a bunch of equity resources that explain how to use this formula, as well as show you some other alternative formulas you can use to calculate this. You can also just use a table. So you say the first hire gets this much, and the second through fifth hire gets this percentage, and so on and so forth. And also on hellostartup.net, I have several tables that list typical percentages based on when you join the company. I'll answer, I see there's a few questions that popped up. Let me just finish up this part of the talk, and then I'll try to jump in and answer those questions. So the fourth part of the offer is the benefits. And the most important thing to keep in mind about benefits is you need to listen to the candidate. Changing jobs and joining a startup, it's a huge life decision. It affects your family, your career, your lifestyle, what you do for most of your waking hours. And so obviously people are going to have concerns and reservations and fears and things that they want to be comfortable with this. And the only way you're going to find out is by listening very carefully. I mean, the way to make an offer that a candidate can't refuse is to listen to them. It's the same way you make any kind of sale. And what you'll find is if you listen, that $1 spent on certain benefits can be worth much more than if you just added that $1 to the candidate's salary. And so there's a lot of different benefits to play with. You actually have to be pretty creative here. But I'll give you some examples. So imagine you offer the candidate an extra week of vacation time. That costs you as a company something like 1/50th of this person's salary, right? It's like giving them approximately a 2% raise. But to a candidate, that week, maybe an extra week they get to spend with their family and loved ones. And that's worth much more than 2% on the salary. Another great example are things like commuter passes and parking passes. They probably cost your company a few $100s, but to a candidate, they're worth much more than that than if you just added a few $100 to their salary. So same thing with offering remote work or allowing candidates to take classes and reimbursing their classes. These are all things that could really help you seal the deal. They don't cost you that much, but they're very valuable. And the only way to know that is to listen to the candidate. Okay, let me look at what questions have popped up. Question, have you looked at top grading? If so, what do you think of that process? I'm actually not familiar with what top grading is, so I'll make a note to Google that and find out. Wish I had a better answer. I'll have to look that one up. Let's see. I've heard that some companies as policy don't provide references except to confirm that a person worked there. I have not seen too many companies that don't check references. I'm not too familiar with why you wouldn't. It seems like a pretty reasonable thing to do, and you do get a lot of value out of it. So I'd be curious for more info for why a company would have such a policy. There could be a perfectly good reason for it. Just every place I've ever worked has done reference checks. Let's see. Question, what do you think about the companies that push you to accept the offer in 1 hour or the offer will be expired? It's a common practice for some companies. Right. So here's the thing about expiration dates on offers. They are completely, totally made up. Completely. Especially in the startup world. Most growing startups hire on a pipeline. In other words, they're always hiring. It's not like there's one position and that's it. They're always looking for really good people. And so there's really no expiration date. Any expiration date that really any company gives you, there's a few exceptions, but for the most part, they just make it up to put pressure on you so that you have to decide quickly, so you can't go get other offers, so you don't get cold feet. That's the main reason they do it. I mean, of course, they want to hire people quickly. They don't want the hiring process to go on forever. But all the expiration dates are made up. And in the vast, vast majority of cases, you can always negotiate it. You can always ask for more time. And if a company's interested in you, they've already spent, right, probably months interviewing you, finding you, hiring you, making an offer. An extra couple of weeks doesn't make a difference, and they will give it to you. If they don't, there's a few exceptions where you have to hire people in a hurry, but for the most part, that's just a bad sign. That's just a company trying to screw you over. So I basically ignore expiration dates and just say I'm going to need more time if I need more time. Okay, let me get to the rest of the questions at the end. I'm just going to wrap up the talk really quickly in case anybody wants to take off since it's been an hour already. Really all I have left is just the recap. And so just to remind you what I talked about here. So first of all, you got to remember that people are the most important part of a startup. The differences between people are huge. Everybody you hire in a tiny startup matters much more. If you have a 5-person company, each person is 20% of your company. And so what all of that means is the most important thing you're going to do is hiring. And hiring is really time-consuming. And founders, if you're a founder, expect to spend more than a quarter of your time, sometimes more than half of your time, just hiring people. So you've got to make sure that you know how to do this efficiently and effectively. And the two most effective ways to find people is to use your network. So get that referral program going, dig through your LinkedIn contacts, reach out to people. Don't be a jerk about it, but just nicely and politely tell people about what you're doing. Try to get them excited. And the second thing is to build a strong brand. Get out there, write some blog posts, open source your code, give talks. This will make your company better in many different ways. It'll probably help you sell your product too, but it'll also give you a really strong employer brand and make people much more interested in joining. When you find somebody, be really thoughtful about how you interview them. Remember, the interview is not an interrogation, and when you're interviewing the candidate, they are interviewing you. So make sure you give them a good experience and make sure you get enough signal from the interview to make a good decision. And finally, at all times, focus on the opportunity. Make sure the candidate knows why your company is awesome. Listen to them to find out what they're interested in. Be fair and transparent, and you'll be able to make an offer that they can't refuse. For more info, check out my book, Hello Startup. You can find it on hello-startup.net, as well as lots of other resources for helping you build a startup. And that's it. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I'll try to read some of the questions out loud and answer them for the next 10 to 20 minutes. Okay, so let me take a quick look at what new questions have popped up. Question, what about offering earning of equity gradually? So whenever you offer someone equity, whether that's a founder or an employee, you always have what's called a vesting schedule. And that means if I'm going to give you 1,000 shares in my company, I don't just give them to you the day you join. I usually spread them out over, let's say, a 4-year period. And so you get 25% of those, 250 shares, after the first year. And then you get the remainder over the next 3, and usually you get a little bit every month. So it's kind of a way to increase the odds that somebody will stick with your company for a long time. Is you do give them equity gradually using a vesting schedule. You can also give people a re-up of stock. In other words, if they've worked at your company for 4 years and they've invested all of their stock and they're still a good employee and you're still excited about them, one way to incentivize them to stay even longer is to give them even more stock with a new vesting schedule for 4 more years. And that's the typical process. And I think that works reasonably well. I think that aligns your incentives pretty well with the employees' incentives. Let's see. Question, how does a startup work if one of the co-founders is not a software engineer? So just about every startup is not just about coding, right? Every startup involves a tremendous number of skills beyond just technical ones. So for example, there's sales, there's marketing, there's management, there's HR, there's office planning, and so on and so forth. There's a ton of skills that are not technical, and most successful startups usually have at least one technical founder, but also at least one non-technical founder. And it's actually good to have that division. I mean, the typical kind of prototype for a startup is one guy who does coding and one person who does sales. And they kind of focus on those 2 areas. And so if you're not a software engineer, that's perfectly fine in the vast majority of startups. In fact, it's probably a good thing. Let's see. Are the presentation slides available? Yes. Let me put a link really quickly. I'll just put it into the group chat so you guys can find them. So all of my talks, including the slides for this presentation and a link back to this webcast, are at ybrickman.com/speaking. So I just put that into the group chat. Let's see. Okay, I think that's all the questions that are in there so far. If you have any others, feel free to ask. Oh, looks like there's one more that I missed. So let's see. I don't mean not checking references. I mean that the reference does not give more information to the hiring company than confirmation that the candidate once worked there. Yes, so that's true. So there are some companies that if you call them up, they won't tell you anything else. But usually reference checks are, in other words, they respect the candidate's privacy. And it is good to check that they're telling the truth on their resume, because, people do make things up. But the type of reference checks that I'm talking about is you just give some personal contact, right? I worked with Ann in this company, and I worked with Bill in this company, and you just call them up. And, I mean, some people aren't willing to provide any info about you, but then you probably shouldn't list them as a reference check. And if they are, then they will tell you a lot about the candidate that you might not have gotten from an interview. It's not always perfect. Sometimes you don't get great information from a reference check, but in a lot of cases, you'll learn some things that are really, really valuable. You'll find out what the person was really like. Okay, question. How do you feel about distribution of age of hires? Not sure what the question is really asking. Maybe you're referring to this idea that in the tech world, there is a bit of ageism where people discriminate a bit based on age. In other words, they don't maybe hire older people. I think that's absurd and ridiculous. I don't necessarily have a great solution for it, but a lot of the best people I've ever worked with were in their 40s, 50s, and older. And that shouldn't be surprising, right? They're experienced. They've built many different things. They've seen many different situations. They are the ultimate T-shaped person. And so if if you're finding that people are not hiring someone because they're too old, I think that's a huge problem. I think that's just as bad as not hiring someone because they're a woman, or not hiring someone because they look different than you, or any other kind of discrimination. So I'm not sure if that was your question, but if not, feel free to re-ask. Let's see. How should you handle work-life balance for a startup? That's a good question. That's a really good question. So this kind of depends on your personal philosophy and beliefs and things like that. So startups do have a reputation for being all-consuming, especially if you're a founder. And that's actually something really important to keep in mind. So if you're a founder, you're on the hook if your company is successful for 10 years. So it's a serious time commitment just in terms of your life. But you're also on the hook pretty much every hour of every day, especially in the early days. You're always on the hook. You're always the one responsible. And so for founders, work-life balance at a startup is hard. It really is. And most founders struggle with this. And I talk about it a little bit in the book, where startups have caused people problems with their health because they never make time to exercise, or problems with their family because they're never home. And you do have to learn to pace yourself. And this is a very hard lesson to learn. You do have to understand that you can't, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And so if you start sprinting, you will not finish. You will burn out long before you're successful. And one of the lessons learned in the book, I had an interview with Zach Holman from GitHub, and one of his lessons learned from his experience with startups is that there really aren't that many emergencies, right? Occasionally, like a server goes down and you have to bring it back up, and fine, that's kind of an emergency. But for the most part, most of the things that were like, oh, you have to do this immediately, you really don't have to do it immediately. It can wait. You can do it tomorrow. Nothing bad will happen if you do it tomorrow. Go home and spend time with your family. So you have to keep it in mind consciously. You have to make exercise part of your schedule. You have to make going home part of your schedule. You have to make taking vacations part of your schedule. There's a startup, I'm drawing a blank. I think it might have been Travis, CI, where what they used to do was they used to have an unlimited vacation policy. In other words, take as much vacation as you want, totally up to you, we're not keeping track. And what they found is, it's a startup and they're spending a lot of hours there, and they found that very few employees were taking vacation. Very few. And people were really burning out, despite this awesome vacation policy. And what they realized is that it's not enough to just say you could do it whenever you want. You have to kind of enforce it. You have to make it part of the schedule. So they actually changed the policy to a minimum vacation policy. And so they actually require everyone, including the founders, to take a certain amount of vacation, at least a certain amount of vacation every single year. And so the founders now are trying to lead by example, by taking time off, by going home at reasonable hours. And that's really important because, again, it's a marathon. It takes 10 years, and you just can't do it. You can't do 80-hour weeks for that long. But it's tough. I certainly haven't found any clean solution to it. Let's see. Next question is, what are the tax implications of a job offer with an equity grant? There's a lot. There are a lot of tax implications. I couldn't even begin to get into how the taxes work for a company. I think you just need to get a lawyer for that. And just in general, whenever you're doing anything with kind of stock and incorporation documents and any of that stuff, make sure you hire a really good startup lawyer and a good accountant to help you with the taxes. There's also a lot of tax implications for the employee. So depending on the type of stock that you get, whether it's an RSU or an ISO, an incentive stock option, or a non-qualifying stock option, there are really significant tax implications depending on when you exercise those shares, when you sell them. And many, many people have bankrupted themselves by getting this wrong. Many employees have joined a startup, got a lot of stock, thought, I'm going to be rich, and then ended up spending a tremendous amount of money and not getting rich and actually bankrupting themselves. And a large part of this comes down to the tax implications. So there's a lot of them. I couldn't really describe them. In the book, I have a primer on equity that gives you some of the things to keep in mind about taxes. It's kind of like a hello world introduction to the taxes. So I recommend you check that out, but also you really need to do your research. Stock for an employer, for a founder, is where you're probably going to make most of your money. If you make money off of a startup, it's not really going to be salary, but it's also very risky due to taxes and other gotchas. So do your homework. In the book, I suggest a few places where you can read more about stock and equity and kind of learn about all of these implications. And also on hellostartup.net in the equity research, there's a lot of articles and books that you can look at to learn about this stuff. Next question. Do you think it's important to find the right lawyer to write up equity agreements and the actual filing for your business? Yes, definitely. You absolutely want to work with a really good lawyer, preferably one that has a lot of experience with startups. So if you happen to live in Silicon Valley, that's pretty easy to find. If you don't, you're going to have to do a little more work. But yes, you should absolutely find a lawyer. One of the funniest things that I heard during one of my interviews from a couple founders is the laws are so complicated that it's almost impossible to run a business legally. It's almost impossible. There's so many gotchas, especially with things like taxes and all of this paperwork, and it's really easy to shoot yourself in the foot, and that can be very expensive. That can be very damaging to your business. Screwing up, for example, how you file the paperwork to incorporate can screw up your ability to raise money. Investors typically want you to be a Delaware C Corp. And if you're not, they might just not invest. Or if you didn't file the paperwork, they might not give you money. So yes, work with a lawyer. It does cost some money up front, but it completely pays for itself over the long term. Question, is it all right if equity agreements are made without a lawyer due to being bootstrapped? I generally wouldn't recommend it. I can't, give a firm answer. I'm sure there have been companies that have done plenty without lawyers, but as I just said, having a good lawyer really keeps you out of a lot of serious, serious problems. And I mentioned earlier that Paul Graham had this blog post called The 18 Mistakes That Kill Startups. And certainly number one on that list was having only a single founder. But another thing on that list was fights between founders or conflicts between founders. And one of the things that founders fight a lot over is things like equity and ownership. And whatever they fight over, once you've kind of lost trust and somebody wants to leave the company, now you're going to fight over, no, you can't take, half the company with you. You don't deserve it. You don't, whatever. And if you don't have a really good, clear, strong legal agreement in place, it's just going to get really messy, and you really don't want to spend time in court. You don't want to spend time litigating things like that. It's just that's going to cost you much more than paying for a lawyer up front, much, much more. If you do decide to go without a lawyer for some of those initial agreements, go online, and there's actually a fair number of, well, first of all, you can use some cheaper services. So there are what's it called, Rocket Lawyer and LegalZoom and a few other services that for a lot less than kind of a private lawyer can help you with things like that. And they also have a lot of the documents kind of ready to go, so you don't have to come up with the documents from scratch. They kind of take care of most of the gotchas for you. So definitely don't do it from scratch. At least try to reuse existing documents that are kind of proven. I think Y Combinator also makes a lot of their legal documents available for free. So start with something like that. But ideally, get a lawyer. Okay, one more question. Let's see. Say you're an early stage startup founder. How would you go about attracting senior technical people currently working in later staged or established companies? Benefits, hop on off, etc. Good question. So it kind of depends, as would the answer to any question like that. Some of the things that are effective. So one of the biggest is the mission. Like, what is it that you as a founder, what is it that gets you up in the morning, right? Why are you willing to dedicate 10 years of your life to this company? And whatever that is, whatever that amazing mission, that bigger goal, that purpose is, that can attract a lot of other people. And so I talked to, for example, Coursera, to some folks at Coursera, and they struggle with offers themselves, right? It's hard to convince people to join Coursera for a slightly lower salary than, let's say, a huge company like a Google, which can offer you an enormous salary. And one of the things that they found at Coursera that really helps them attract candidates is their mission. It's the fact that they're trying to provide education for the whole world. That's an important mission. That's something that you might wake up on a Saturday to work on, is trying to teach everyone in the world. And so they find that they have a lot of people coming out of, let's say, Wall Street jobs, right, that are very, very high paying. And they come into Coursera and they say, look, right now I'm working in Wall Street. I don't feel like I'm helping the world at all. Maybe I'm even making the world worse. And so I'm going to join you even for a lower salary just because I think your mission is much more important and I would just enjoy my day-to-day job much more. So I think I mentioned it a bunch of times during the talk. It's that opportunity. It's the reason you as a co-founder are there in the first place. Because it's not money, or at least I hope it's not money. Money is not actually a good motivator for most things. It's important. It's absolutely important, but it's not the best motivator. So mission is one. Benefits is another big one that startups can do a lot of, and this is where you have to really listen to the candidate. But, for example, being able to work from home, especially for people with families or that don't like working normal schedules, that could be a huge benefit that they can't get a lot of companies. Sometimes being able to own a large system or to own a lot of these important decisions is a huge benefit to people. So at a large company, if you show up at Google, well, all the infrastructure is already in place. Most of the interesting decisions have already been made, and so you're just sort of filling in the blanks. And at a startup, you get to make all of those decisions, which has its own cost, but it can attract a lot of engineers, especially senior engineers. They like to own important decisions. I know I do. So that's another thing to focus on. In the book, there's a chapter on culture, and there's a whole section in there about motivation. And so I talk about kind of autonomy, mastery, purpose, and offering these things to people. It's a great way to attract them. And then the final piece, and I list it last because I don't think it should be the first thing you offer to people, but what a startup can offer is equity. In other words, you get stock. Now, stock is, in a startup, since most startups fail, stock is largely a lottery ticket, or another way to look at it is a very high-risk investment. But if it pays off, it can change your life. So if you're joining a different company because you're going to make $20,000 extra a year there, well, that's nice. But to be honest, those $20,000 extra a year probably won't change your life, especially after taxes. They're just going to sit in your bank account and you probably won't notice them. But if the startup is successful and that stock actually pays off, it could change your life. That could be much, much more money. And this is actually how most engineers who don't found their own companies, if they get rich, if they become really successful, the way they do that is by joining several different startups, getting stock, and then one of them they get lucky and pays off. So stock is another way to attract people. It's a chance to really change your life. It's a lottery ticket, though, so I wouldn't make it the main thing. Okay, any other questions?